Thanks, Arlie. So this year, I'm going to be talking about the budget a little bit different and a little bit in more detail. There are times where I kind of feel like both my job as a pastor and my job as an accountant is to get up and do my best to try to explain something to people that they may not understand, wave my hands, and have you be assured that everything's okay. With some of the decisions that we had to make this year in terms of our budgeting process, we wanted to be a little bit more transparent in how the budget is set and how some of the decisions that we made this year that were difficult were made. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk through some of that narrative description before we actually get to the actual numbers in the budget. So to give you an idea of how we go about setting the budget for MCEC, I would consider our budgeting process to be highly collaborative. What I mean by that is we try to build the budget from the bottom up, not from the top down. So what happens when we start our budgeting process is I send out a spreadsheet to the ministry leaders with a question. If you put a cost to what you think God is calling you to do in your area this year, what does it look like? I don't tell them what everyone else on the ministry leadership team is doing. And I also don't tell them what I think the givings from churches and individuals and revenue will add up to for the year when I ask that question. And I do that because what I find happens is if you tell someone you have this much money to spend, it changes their thinking in terms of how they discern what God might be asking them to do in their ministry area. And so I ask them to submit their desired spending budget without having any idea yet what the revenue projections are going to be. When those documents are sent back to me, I marry that with my own revenue projection based on either information churches have communicated to me or based on what I see in the giving pattern for each of the churches that support MCEC with monthly, quarterly, bi-monthly, or annual giving. And I dump it all into one document, and I cross my fingers, and I wait for Excel to tell me how good it is or how good it isn't. So we went through that process this year the same way that we have every other year. What it led to was, for the first time since I've been here, it led to an initial document that said that we were $130,000 overspending in terms of what had initially been proposed. That's not a huge number compared to a $2.5 million budget, but it's also not insignificant. And so we had to have some difficult conversations because it meant that either we needed to reduce our spending and what we were proposing to spend by $130,000, or we had to somehow increase our revenue by $130,000 in order to present a balanced budget at this gathering. And the deficit was higher this year than what has been typical for the last several years in terms of the initial draft and marrying of everybody's dreams into one financial document. And sometimes the accountant is seen as the dream crusher. And I don't want to be seen as that. But the reality is that we need to be responsible with the funds that we're given in order to make sure we're spending them in the best way that God is directing us to at that time. So just to give you some context, the next slide, I'm sure that if you were to look at the giving pattern of your own congregations over the course of these 10 years, this probably would look familiar to many of you in terms of a trend as to what you're seeing. But I'm trying to make sure I'm putting into context. In 2009, the giving that we received, this is just giving from churches. This is nothing to do with individuals or estate donations or anything like that. And if you look at our budget, the bulk of our revenue in terms of an operating basis comes from the generous giving that we get from congregations and their budgets. So if you look at 2009, we received just under $2.4 million from congregations, $2,357,318. For 2019, the year that just ended, that we just reviewed this morning, we received $1,862,838 from congregations. So that's a drop of pretty close to $500,000. It hasn't happened all in one shot. You can see that the graph kind of moves down gradually. It's a little bit this year, a little bit the next year, a little bit the next year, a little bit the next year. But it is continuing to trend in a downward direction. I have no doubt that probably some of that is due to the fact that your congregational budgets may have been doing the same things over the last number of years, dropping a little bit this year, a little bit the next year, a little bit the next year, and so forth. But it does get to the point where the erosion of where we were means that we have to make some more difficult decisions about where we are and, to me, more importantly, where we're going. The other thing that I want to mention is that restricted fund draws. So if you looked at the discernment documents, if you're an accounting junkie, and you looked closely through the discernment documents, you would have seen a schedule in there about the cash that's in what we call our restricted funds. And just to remind people, restricted fund means that it's been pulled aside out of the operating revenue of our regular activity as MCEC and set aside either because a donor directed that the money they gave us had to be used for a specific purpose, or because as a collective group, MCEC, through its executive council, has earmarked money to be used in a specific purpose. We are blessed at MCEC to have a lot of money set aside in restricted funds. And we're blessed not only because we have that money, but in my mind, we're blessed because we have a clear articulation of how and when that money is to be used, how one accesses it or applies for it, and what our limits are in terms of what we may pull out of it in terms of any given year without getting the approval of the Executive Council and ultimately the delegates. It's a blessing to me as someone who walked in to have that clear definition that helps me to understand, without having been there, what the intention was, what it's going to be, and what I need to continue to steward and manage. So there are two main restricted funds that draws that support the MCEC operating budget, and I've listed them up here. There's the Mission Donations and Bequest Fund, which is a fund where every time we get a state donation that specifies missions or some version of missions, that money's set aside into this fund, and a certain percentage of that fund is allowed to be drawn in every year to the Mission Council budget in order to support church planning activity, church leadership development, and other mission-related objectives that are part of MCEC operations. The other fund is our Faithful Steward Fund, which is our name for our General Reserve Fund. So if we've had years of surplus, or we have times where a state gives us a donation of greater than $5,000, then that money gets set aside into this reserve fund, and we're able to pull money from the reserve fund into our operating budget in order to help balance it out on a year-by-year basis. We do that so that we're smoothing out these things, so that if we get a donation of $100,000 from an estate one year, we don't rush out and spend that whole $100,000 that year because it's burning a hole in our pockets. We put it aside and we gradually bring it in to our operating spending in order to support a stable and steady ongoing ministry through MCEC. The other thing to remember about these two funds is that 10% of the receipts that MCEC has received from the Schmidt estate has gone into each of these two funds over the last several years. And so the balances of these two funds are as high now as they probably will ever be. And so where we used to be pulling in 15% of a low balance in terms of our reserve fund, we're now able to pull in 15% of a fairly high balance, which has allowed us to do some neat things over the last couple of years and allowed us to continue to spend at a level that was somewhat above the givings that we were receiving from churches. The problem is we can't live off of that forever. And if we choose to pull in money from restricted funds in order to allow us to not make budget changes now, then the day will come 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 15 years from now, where someone, if it's not me, would have to stand up in front of you and say, we need to make really painful cuts this year because we have a $500,000 gap between our revenue and what we want to spend. And I don't think it's responsible of us to leave for our children and their children a financial situation that is dire because we chose to live high on the hog today because the money was there. Just to illustrate that point, for fiscal year 2018, the opening balance of our Mission Donations and Bequest Fund was just over $1 million, which meant that the operating draw that we made was $179,852 to support Mission Council activity in fiscal year end 2018. Because we made that draw and because we didn't receive estate donations that balanced that draw during the year, the balance at the end of the year was $925,260, which means in this year's budget, even though we're using the same percentage of the total fund in order to support Mission Council activity, there's almost $20,000 less in real money for Mission Council to be able to spend out of that draw. And the same thing is true of the Faithful Steward Fund, the General Reserve Fund. In fiscal year 2018, we were approved to spend up to $207,217 from that fund. This year, the maximum that we'd be able to draw would be $195,013. So without doing anything different, even if every church sent in exactly what they sent last year and nothing else changed in our budgeting system, we'd have a revenue deficit of $32,000 for this year, simply because the fund balances have depleted and the amount that we're able to pull out by policy is less. So that left us in a difficult position to make some difficult budget decisions when it came time to prepare our spending plan for this year. We did not want to make up this entire difference on the backs of our external partners. The easiest, and because I pastor a church, I feel like I can say this, the easiest way for a church to meet their budget is to look at all the money that's spent on something outside of your church and cut it. And as someone who draws their salary from a church, there are days where that seems really appealing. But I don't think it's the way that God's calling us to act, and I don't think it's a responsible way for us to be able to be together as a wider community to support the different things that God's doing through all of these agencies. But unfortunately, reductions in grant to external partners was going to have to be part of the solution, because more than 50% of the new revenue that we receive every year gets sent to all of our ministry partners in the wider church, through our schools, and through our camps. It is not possible for us to make up this entire difference without involving our partners. Our revenues, as the slide before has shown, have been decreasing gradually since the last time that partner reductions were made in 2010, and we simply were not in a position any longer to be able to carry that difference over that number of years and that large a gap. And so, to be transparent, the deficit was made up in the following ways. We made reductions to external partners, which were the first such reductions since 2010. Specifically, we reduced our grant to AMBS by $16,000 from the previous budget year. But at the same time, we are working to transfer a $95,000 restricted fund that is currently on MCEC's books that is earmarked to help and support AMBS. And so we're going to try to cushion the blow of the reduction by being able to send that fund to AMBS for them to manage and for them to use. And we've reduced grants to all our partner schools and camps by 5% across the board. So the total budget change was $30,639, which was 23% of the gap that we needed to make up in order to have our budget balance. The second thing we did was we made changes to MCEC administrative staffing. So we eliminated the accounting assistant staff position, essentially a bookkeeping position, effective February 15th, 2019. So unfortunately for all of you, you have to wait for me to enter everything and pay everything because there isn't somebody else that's doing that right now. And some days I have lots of time for that, and other days not as much. So I hope that you can be patient with me as we continue to work out the kinks and try to get everybody their money when they're expecting it. So the total budget change as a result of that move was $45,612, which was 35% of the deficit that we were attempting to make up. The third thing that we did, which I talked about last night, we decided to split the $38,000 worth of budgeted travel costs for delegates to go to the MC Canada gathering into the 2 years that had transpired in between gatherings. So rather than, like I said last night, have zero budgeted in a year where there isn't a gathering and then have to come up with $38,000 of reductions in the following year in order to send delegates to assembly, we're spreading that out so that every year there's roughly the same amount of money budgeted, whether we're using it or not, in order to make sure that we're not having to cut spending drastically in years where there's an MC Canada delegate assembly. So the total budget change for that was $19,000, which is 14% of the initial deficit. And then the other thing we did was we took a look at some of the things that we had in our operating budget that were some non-repeating, one-time sort of expenses, and managed to make some draws from some of our restricted funds and our deferred funds in order to cover those one-time sort of expenses. And so the total budget change as a result of that was $36,684, which is 28% of our initial deficit. So between those four measures, we managed to make up $131,935, which allowed us to be able to balance our budget. None of those decisions were easy. We had many discussions as staff as to what the best and the right approach was to try to discern how we should do this and how we should go about it. What I don't ever want to be in the position of doing is having to stand up here and tell you guys about drastic things that we have to do because we don't have a choice, as opposed to making these reductions gradually as we go, according to the revenue projections we have, so that it's a much smoother ride to eventually settle to wherever things land. So in terms of the actual budget then, if you want to look on page 28 of your discernment guide, it left us with the budget that we're presenting to you for approval today. So in terms of revenue, the only thing I'd really remark about in here is the church giving you'll see is down slightly in terms of our projections. So our budgeted from last year when I was here was $1,885,383. We actually received from congregations $1,862,423. And based on my best estimate of where I think we would come in the years in the coming year, we would end up at $1,828,451. So that's a reduction of about $30,000 or $40,000 from our actual giving last year. Some of that is due to churches that are continuing to give but are giving less. Some of that is to put a factor in for congregations that have indicated that they are leaving, have left, or intending to leave, which will reduce our overall giving from churches as well. So it leaves us with gross revenue for this coming year in our budget at $2,369,555. On our partner payments, again, the reductions that we mentioned are the ones that are reflected in terms of our partner ministries and the grants that we are giving to these ministries. So it was 5% across the board for all of the schools and camps, with the exception of AMBS, which was a $16,000 reduction with the restricted fund that we have for them at Abundance Canada being transferred, and that's in process now. And there was a reduction of $20,000 in what we were committing to Mennonite Church Canada in terms of their operating grants. So from $630,000 down to $610,000. So that leaves us with a net operating revenue to cover MCEC expenses of $1,046,009. Our council budgets are, for the most part, unchanged in terms of what we plan to spend. You can see that the net spend in the Mission Council area has gone up. That's because the revenue that we're drawing from the restricted fund that supports Mission Council activity is down. So even though the spending itself is roughly the same, the net spend is up because there's less of an offset from the money that we're bringing in from the restricted fund to help cover those expenses. The Executive Council budget includes the $19,000 for the second half of the travel expenses for delegates that are going out to the MC Canada gathering in June. And the operations budget includes the staff reductions that I talked about before in terms of eliminating the accounting assistant position. So that's a total ministry expense within MCC of $1,241,022, which leaves us with a surplus or deficit from operations of $195,013, which is the amount that we're able to transfer from Faithful Steward Fund according to policy based on the opening balance, leaving us with a balanced budget. So I've tried to be as clear as I can without trying to over-explain things. I do find that sometimes giving more information is actually less clear. But for sure, if people have questions about the schedules that follow these, that break down more how the councils are spending the money, what kinds of programs are involved in there, we are perfectly prepared to answer those questions. I just don't want to take up an hour of everybody's time going through every line item detail by detail in order to arrive at the answer. So thank you for your continued support, and we just wish that you would convey back to your congregations that we appreciate their support and that we continue to try to do the best we can with the givings that congregations are able to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And we're going to be acting on the spending plan a little bit later this afternoon. But we could take a few minutes now for questions. We have a mic there from the floor and a mic here from the floor. If you have a question or a comment that you feel is pertinent for all of us to hear and understand, please come to the mic, state your name and your congregation or your ministry that you come from, and Sean gets to answer the questions. Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Marcus Shantz. I'm from Conrad Grable University College. This is just a comment. And I'll preface this by saying I've consulted with some of the other, not all of them, but a number of the other partner ministries. And so I think I'm safe in saying I speak on behalf of that group when I say that we're very grateful for the continued support of MCEC. And also we're grateful for the trust that it represents when you send us funds. We know that you're sending us the Lord's money, and that we're to use it for the work of the church, and that's what we use it for, and we're very grateful for that ongoing support. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Marcus. Appreciate that. Are there other questions or comments that anybody would like to make? Please come to the mic.
So last year there was a...
Can you give your name and congregation
Right.
first?
Victor Clausen from Sterling. So last year there was a request made on the floor for more support for youth, and this morning we heard about the term being extended for somebody. Where does that appear?
Do you want to explain where that shows?
So any of the spending on those youth initiatives, depending on whether they're supporting youth leaders or whether it's an event that's for youth, will be included in either the Leadership Council budget or the Congregational Resourcing budget. So it'll be a mixture of those two in terms of how those are budgeted for.
And what I also understand from that comment is that it would be nice, it's good that we can spend money on trying to figure out what we're doing with our youth. Other questions or comments that anybody would like to offer? All right, then we'll come back to that a bit later this afternoon. Thank you, Sean, that was clear, and you're always clear at our Executive Council meetings, and it's very helpful.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to bring this motion to you. It's motion number 7 on page 8. On behalf of the Executive Council, I move that we accept the 2019-2020 spending plan as presented. Arlie? I didn't want to get out of order. You have to ask for a second.
Okay. And we need a seconder to support that motion. Someone ready to jump in?
At the back.
At the back there. Name and church? All right, thank you. And are there any further questions or comments about this motion? All right, then we'll call the question. Everybody in favor of approving the motion as presented, please raise your hand. And thank you. And are there any opposed? All right, that motion is carried. Thank you.